We're back with a case review. This one's pretty interesting. It's the NZXT H5 Flow, and it has basically a toilet in the bottom of it. At least that's what Andrew on our team sort of described it as when he saw that there was just this swirling shaped hole at the bottom of the case, angled away from the case, and that's where the fan goes. So there's two fans in this one. One is shoved in the bottom down there, and that shoves the air straight up into sort of the right half of the GPU, but it misses most of the CPU. So that's gonna be really interesting thermally. And then the back of the case has a 120 mil rear exhaust fan, and that's all you get for this case. It is $95. Comes in a few colors as usual, and there's an elite version which glasses out the front of the case, further restricting your airflow options. But you could still get something built well in it. It's just, this one takes a little bit more effort because they don't ship it in the config they probably should. So let's take a look. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and our large anti-static mod mat for PC building on store.gamersnexus.net. These are our top-selling item, and they're incredibly useful for both their convenience and their anti-static performance. The GN Large Mod Mat provides a high-quality PC building work surface that protects the table from damage while also providing you with useful, standardized wiring diagrams from public ATX and PCIe specifications for quick access to what you're working on. The thick rubberized material is anti-static conductive, and it's also highly heat resistant, which makes it excellent for tube bending projects for custom loop builds, and also durable just if you're kind of dinging the case around the table while you build the system. Grab one on store.gamersnexus.net to support our in-depth testing while getting something useful in return. So first of all, just to start this out, talking with Patrick when we were working on reviewing this case, the comment he made, I thought really made a lot of sense, and it was very simply, I want to like this case. And I agree with that sentiment. There's a lot about this case that they've built it in a way where it looks pretty nice. It's come together very neatly and compactly, so that's a positive for most people at most builds. And then internally, NZXT keeps one of its key strengths alive, which is really good cable management. So they've done well on those points. They've also added some unique molding. So like the power supply shroud, it's actually built in a really solid way, feels pretty good. They've done a good job with the plastics. But unfortunately, when it comes to execution of the design in totality to perform well, they sort of, NZXT's dropped the ball. The good news is this is mostly a resolvable problem. You can add a couple fans to the front. We'll have testing for you in this review showing the impact of that, and you get there. But of course, as soon as you start adding fans, you start adding cost, and when you add cost, you might as well potentially consider another case in a higher price category. One key aspect with this case though, is that because it's shorter and generally smaller, and it has a power supply shroud that runs pretty tall, if you're on a modern GPU with say 3-ish slots, you're gonna be getting really close to the power supply shroud. And the closer you get to it, the more restricted the air intake will be, the more bottom intake actually starts to matter. So that's kind of where NZXT's weird toilet bowl, it's the new name of it now, intake fan makes sense, because they need that bottom intake to help force feed air into a larger GPU, but it shouldn't have to be at the expense of CPU intake. There could just be a fan here, price goes up, that's the problem. So after years of becoming increasingly dissatisfied with airflow in NZXT cases, and we were sort of disappointed in the H5 Flow as well, this one gave us a little bit of hope, but is not quite there. The foundation of our complaints was that the H5 Flow launched at $110 at a time when the H5 non-flow was selling for $75. We don't know whether the Flow was that much more expensive to produce, but from a consumer perspective, frankly, it just doesn't matter. Our conclusion for that one was basically buy the other one, it's cheaper and good enough. But for this one, they've brought the price back down. The H5 is more than a smaller version of the H7, which we've already reviewed if you're curious. And the other differences mostly include that fan at the bottom, which ultimately allows NZXT to get one step closer to achieving its dream, a completely sealed power supply shroud hotbox. The sculpt is smooth, and it looks like a natural part of the shroud. And the fans and labels are color matched to blend in, so excellent attention to detail by NZXT. This is something that NZXT has typically done pretty well with. There's a discrete vent and there's a filter at the bottom of the case, and those supply air to the fan. We'd prefer one lawn front ejecting filter, but that's not a feature we often see on cases at this price point. It would make it much more manageable though. The duct allows the fan to sit low in the case near the intake fan while also keeping the fan blades free of cable clutter. And when you start screwing around with the fan like this, that's an important step to consider. Unfortunately, the fan and the duct occupy the space that would typically be used for hard drives. So drive support in the H5 Flow and the Elite is extremely sparse. There's room for two 2.5-inch drives, or one 3.5-inch and one 2.5-inch. The 3.5-inch mounting location has no vibration damping or ventilation, but it's positioned well in terms of just avoiding cable management conflicts. The duct also removes any possibility of installing radiators longer than 280 mil, but this was already a limitation of the H510. Finally, we'd recommend limiting your power supply length to about 160 millimeters, because longer power supplies, although technically will work, you would still have loose cables you need to stash somewhere, and stashing those between the duct and the power supply would be easier than between the duct and the side panel. To get the duct and the bottom fan out properly, the manual suggests removing the front fan mount and the cable bar, which ideally should be done before a system is installed in the case. We wouldn't recommend removing the duct. The space can't be easily used for anything else, but it's a little bit clumsy. On that point of cable management, we remain happy overall with NZXT's execution of cable management. So for the top of the case, there's just one massive cutout for cables to come through, which is good, because in a case that's tighter like this, it means if you have kind of weird placement of the EPS 12-volt cable, you don't have to fight to pull it through the only slot you have available to you. It's just the whole thing. And they've done it in a way that doesn't look bad. So that's good. There's also about 2.8 centimeters of clearance on the backside over here, so plenty of room to work with for the most part for cables behind the motherboard tray. And there's a lot of packed in cable tie points, and there's some also included and well-placed Velcro straps with cable guides. So NZXT, as it often does, has executed the cable management well, and as it often does, is leaving the thermals lacking, which we'll come back to. Limiting the top fan mounts to 120 millimeters, at least officially. You could get more up there, but 120 mil is what should be up there maximally. That means that the cutout should have adequate clearance even with a radiator installed to run your cables through. Now, from the materials provided by NZXT, it's clear that the company's vision for the case includes 2 additional front fans. Every test done by NZXT and every render in the reviewer's guide shows 2 fans mounted behind the Flow's front panel. After all, there's no point in buying a case with a ventilated front panel if you're not going to put fans behind it. And the case doesn't come with any. We have to assume that the bottom intake fan was a feature designed with the Elite sealed front panel in mind, but it ended up as the only intake here. Because of this, the cost of an extra couple fans should be factored into the H5 Flow's price when you're considering it. And when you're talking pressure too, where the pressure system, it's pretty evenly distributed here. In fact, the internal components are likely to contribute almost more to the pressure than the built-in fans because they're distant and few. But for pressure, what you can end up with is, depending on the system configuration ultimately, that bottom fan, you might lose a little bit of the air out the front, or more likely, you're just not going to have the strength in that CPU cooler to get air in as quickly as it needs to get in to sort of flush the case and keep the internal ambient. Flush the case, and we're talking about a toilet being in the bottom. Great, not intentional. To keep the internal case ambient temperature under control, you're sort of lacking some of that power centrally. In some negative pressure enclosures, so notably NZXT's own H500, the old one, passive airflow through the rear expansion slots can have a significant and positive impact on GPU thermals. The slot covers on the H5 Flow are tightly packed, and they're completely sealed this time, either for aesthetic reasons, because NZXT, or to force an airflow path. We'll decide which in the thermal section coming up shortly. The upside of the H5's unambitious claims about radiator compatibility is that those claims aren't lies. That's often the trade-off with case manufacturers. You've got ambitious claims, but possibly lies, and you have unambitious claims, probably not lies. NZXT went with the latter this time, so that's good. The top mount says it fits 2 40mm radiators, and it does. Same with the front mount, and also 280 millimeters. But the top mount is offset from the motherboard, so it avoids clearance issues. The top-mounted coolers will still overlap the motherboard a bit and make it harder to access, so the front mount is really preferable here for an AIO. Installing a standard front AIO requires installing the fans in between that very front panel and the outside of the chassis, so it's still in the case. It's just between the two. And then you would put the radiator on that mounting bar in there. So that allows for a 45mm maximum radiator thickness as listed in the spec sheet. The side panels have been slightly revised since the previous Flow. So the steel panel now simply slides back and off with 2 captive screws that get loosened, while the glass panel is popped out by pulling at one corner. This is sort of the new way to do it. The fasteners seemed unusually stiff in our sample, leading to the glass bending more than we'd like when removing the panel, but it was nothing permanent. And this improved as the paint wore off, for better or for worse. NZXT gets credit for matching the top panel to the front panel in the Flow. It makes sense to remove the top filter from the case with positive pressure or top exhaust configurations, but it rarely looks good. And NZXT's compromise to keep the panel looking tidy at the top was to include only two 120mm mounts. That's a step up from the H510's single top mount, at least. On to I/O, it consists of one USB Type-A port, one USB Type-C, one audio jack, and this is an old argument, but our position remains the same. There should be at least two Type-A ports, because only connecting one still eats up an entire motherboard header. You can get two, so you should have two. The front panel connections, power, reset, and so forth, are unified into a single header. It should work with every motherboard on the market at this point, but it's worth double checking before connecting. There isn't any splitter included to break out the combined 4-pole audio jack into input and output, so you've got that to think about as well. And while we're talking about the front of the case, the front filter is layered within the front panel, covering its entire surface. Because of its size and lack of reinforcement, it sags inwards significantly, as we mentioned in the H7 review. This shouldn't be a problem though, because normal 25mm thick fans will always have approximately 25mm of distance from the filter, so you shouldn't have to worry about it getting sucked in and dragging on the blades. And finally, the H5 is compatible with NZXT's existing vertical GPU mounting kit, which you should not use. The kit itself is separately purchased and should not be bought, and it's $90. So first of all, it's $5 less than the entire case you had put it in. And secondly, this is absolutely not anywhere near enough clearance for any video card basically on the market at this point, because even if it does fit vertically, it will suffer and suffocate thermally. And the only reason it'd be okay would be if it's water cooled, at which point you're probably running a bigger case and not this one, at least an H7. Time to get into testing. In addition to our standard battery of thermal tests, we tried adding two 140mm Noctua NF A14s to the front mount without any other changes whatsoever. This is a case with a ventilated front panel that ships with 0 front fans. There's sort of an expectation that fans will be added. And NZXT even makes that assumption in its own marketing materials and reviewer guide, but obviously it doesn't include any. So that's why we added them. We also tested with the included two NZXT F120Q 1200 RPM 120mm fans. They are not PWM, and we measured these at about 1300 to 1350 RPM, which is within the stated 10% variance. In terms of competition, things to pay attention to, the Fractal Pop Air RGB is probably the #1 competitor here and the newest. There's also the Phanteks G360A, which we've actually tested, but we haven't produced the review for yet, and they're both similarly priced alternatives. NZXT's own older H510 Flow is also a serious competitor, but we assume they'll probably kill that one soon, so only until it runs out of stock. Here's the first thermal chart, starting with just some NZXT cases. Running our full system CPU and GPU torture workload, the CPU in our test system averaged 54 degrees Celsius above ambient with the stock case. That would typically drop dramatically with the removal of the front panel, even in a high airflow case. But because there are no stock front intake fans in the H5 Flow, average CPU temperatures just didn't change. Adding two front fans to the existing stock config did cause an impressive and gigantic 13-degree drop, down to 41 degrees. The stock fan layout ignores the ventilated front panel to its detriment. And if you buy this case, we'd strongly recommend additional fans, but that increases price into territory of higher-end cases. Even ignoring comparison to other cases, the H5 Flow doesn't even compete against NZXT. When you look at the H510 Flow, which is older, doing better here. Comparatively, the Pop Air from Fractal performed significantly better with its own stock fan layout, averaging 47 degrees in this test. The G360A, not plotted here, performs similarly well. We noted in our original review that the H510 Flow had lackluster thermal performance without additional fans, but even its 52-degree average beats the H5 Flow here. Taking the score from the test with two additional front fans would put the H5 Flow at the very top of the chart alongside the Fractal Torrent. But almost every other case on this chart was tested exclusively with stock fans, and the fans we used in the H5 Flow are good, so it's not really a fair comparison or like for like. Back to just the NZXT cases now. The GPU averaged 61 degrees Celsius above ambient, in the same test, and was again unaffected by removing the front panel. It's just on the edge of test variance here. And the front panel doesn't factor into the thermal performance when there are no fans mounted behind it, at least with this system. Adding the two 140mm front fans didn't improve thermals as dramatically as it did for the CPU, but the temperature reduction we're seeing here down to 55 degrees is significant when we're talking GPU performance. It's harder to force that number down, at least with our test bench, and the GPU is already getting the most access to air anyway in the stock config. Versus the H5 Flow, the H5 Flow isn't exciting really at all. NZXT's last effort was just better. Comparatively, the Pop Air RGB's GPU thermals were a weak point, but 57 degree average still beats the H5 Flow somehow. NZXT's ducted bottom intake fan is a great idea for the right case. The H5 Elite, which we don't have, might make more sense there. That one has a tempered glass front panel that seriously limits airflow, so you don't have many options. In the H5 Flow, though, there's no need to compromise by pulling air through the bottom. The ventilated front panel is right there and is better. And several of NZXT's case illustrations even show NVIDIA Founders Edition cards with flow-through coolers. This could potentially benefit more from bottom intake, but additional fans really, we think, are a necessity on this case. You should be adding them to the front. In 3D Mark, which is sort of a gaming benchmark stand-in for us, the results are similar to before. The GPU runs warmer in the stock configuration when compared to most of the other cases of the same price, so not really a great look. We're now moving on to Blender testing. This is used for two workloads. One is CPU only, and then one is GPU only. And that reduces the total heat load in the system to just one component. So it represents when you're only using one part to do some type of processing. In the first of our Blender tests, rendering exclusively on the CPU reached a steady state average of 36 degrees Celsius above ambient. The H5 Flow does much better relative to about half the other cases here, thanks to the lack of GPU heat sort of flowing up and past the CPU cooler. And the directly competing Pop Air RGB is at about 36 degrees average as well, so it gives the H5 Flow a fight. The H510 wasn't much different, at least the Flow version of it wasn't. Rendering on the GPU brought its average to 30 degrees, putting the H5 firmly back at the bottom of the stack again. Again, that's above ambient. Each of our points of comparison performed better, with the Pop Air RGB and the H510 Flow tied at 25 degrees. For our standardized fan test, we fully removed the bottom fan and the duct assembly for this one, and we installed our own fans in the usual configuration. So that's two 140mm front intake and one 120mm rear exhaust. This is a standardized test we run, and we added it after viewer requests. The particular methodology we've refined as much as we can, but it has some inherent flaws to it by way of the approach. But because it's so requested, and because we like to do what you all like to see, we added it. But our approach was to just inform the community of the potential flaws in a separate video, which is in this shot here. The CPU averaged 41 degrees above ambient for this one, and that's the same as when we added the two 140mm fans to the stock layout, which makes sense. The main difference between the two is the bottom intake fan, which is isolated from the CPU cooler for the most part. This is one of the best scores on the chart for CPU temperatures, which is impressive for a case that scored so poorly in the baseline torture tests. But it does indicate that NZXT could have done better here stock. 41 degrees is on par with the Fractal Torrent Compacts, within error, and the Fractal Pop here. The H510 Flow's 42 degrees is within variance, and for the GPU that averaged 60 degrees over ambient, which is an indication that the bottom intake fan actually is helpful for GPU thermals. The test with the stock fans plus two intake fans averaged 55 degrees here. 60 is the relevant number for this chart though, which is among the worst performers on the chart. With stock fans removed as a factor, Fractal's Pop Air RGB stands out in this test, with a 52 degree average that thoroughly defeats the H5 Flow. Most of our testing is done with all the case fans at 100% speed, so noise normalized testing is the exception, where our goal is to get the entire system down to a 36 dB noise level at 20 inches. The H5 Flow started out fairly loud for a two-fan case at 41.2 dBA, and reducing noise levels to our chosen threshold required reducing fan speeds to 65%, with a resulting observed speed just over 1,000 RPM. So then, here's the chart at 36 dBA noise levels. CPU temperature stayed close to baseline, only increasing to 56 degrees despite the drop in fan speed. That's still among the warmer results on the chart, although it's better than the H510 Flow's 57 degrees. The Pop Air RGB again does well with a 48 degree average, and thermally looks like the better selection. Conclusions then. So first and foremost, there's really not much point in buying a front ventilated case without putting fans in the front. At least not unless they're pulling the air in from somewhere else, and they're not. You could do interesting things with this case. You could do top intake, for example, if you had the glassed out front version where the Elite wouldn't be able to pull air in really through the front. You're kind of left at the bottom. You can get some in through the top. That would be sufficient for mid-range builds. And although people kind of aren't used to top intake because hot air rises and therefore it feels kind of weird, you're directing the air with fans that are far more powerful than the energy exchange of rising air, and so you're fine. It'll work well. It does just fine for cases where you don't have many options. But ultimately, they've really fallen flat for the fans. And this Flow, even if it would push the price up a little bit, and the price is something we've complained about with past ones, it does kind of need them. Otherwise, it just feels a little bit empty. It's possible to move the bottom intake fan to the front, and that would sort of help with the CPU. But the duct is a central feature of the case. And with an MSRP of $95, it just doesn't feel great to start basically eliminating features that contribute to that. So with that in mind, there are some better performing cases on the market if that's what you're interested in. First of all, the Fractal Pop Air did extremely well in our benchmarking and our reviews previously, and it's competitive to this in size and price, and certainly in performance it's outdoing this one. The Phanteks G360A we haven't published a review for yet, but we have tested, and it's outperforming this case as well, similarly to the Pop Air. They run pretty close to each other, and the pricing is also competitive for the G360A. We would look at those two first before this one. Now, and the G360A, by the way, is about $100 with a rebate available if you factor those in on some retailers. So NZXT, what it brings to the cable, well, that works out. What it brings to the table is cable management. And while the others have pretty good cable management as well, NZXT basically says, we're going to do cable management well, and we're going to make it look a certain way, kind of like that almost weird Apple-like aesthetic, but not necessarily as tasteless. Fight me, we don't review Apple products, so I can say that. They do the look thing for basically all of the appeal of this case, and if the look side of it isn't interesting to you, then just skip the case unless you're going to buy fans. So that's kind of where it starts to stand out, is if you decide this is now going to be, instead of a $95 case, I'm going to consider this to be a $130 case, you go buy two decent fans, you throw them up front, suddenly it's pretty damn good. There's a lot of potential here. It's just not realized stock. So, talking with Patrick at the end of all this review process, the sort of sentence we came up with to sum this whole thing up was, I want to like it, but if I want to like it, I like the H7 better. And then he also said he likes the G360A at $100 more than this too. So this is one of those where it's like we don't hate it. It is actually a good case in terms of construction quality and everything else. It's just it needs those fans. The good news is that's not a critical error that you can't fix. It just throws off the value. So take that for what it is. You like the case, go buy some fans, you're done. If that makes it cost too much, then buy the other thing instead. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, like by grabbing one of our mod mats or our coaster packs. We have 4 new coasters on the store. And thanks again for supporting us. Check back for more. We'll see you all next time.